no one coming forward, we can field questions, and actually I'd like to lead by, I've got a question for our city attorney, Brian. You've had a chance to review the business item and the resolution. You're familiar with our rules of procedure and our municipal code. Are we in a position legally to take this kind of action at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did since our last meeting, I reviewed the packet materials. I did review the code as well as Robert's Rules of Order. You know, a censure, I think, is pretty clearly a measure of discipline against a member of the governing body. Robert's Rules of Order does govern the procedure by which discipline is to be effected upon a member of the body. And basically, if you look in Section 61 of Robert's Rules of Order...
We're probably going to have you read from that. Okay. I don't think we've all got copies.
Yeah. It says, it talks about, there are basically two types of offenses that members can be disciplined for under Robert's Rules of Order. And I didn't connect the dots here. Our code talks about, first it mentions the adoption of the governing body rules of procedure. And then in section 2.05.050, it dictates that as to any procedural issues that are not covered by the rules of procedure that have been adopted by the council, then they are referred to Robert's Rules of Order. The governing body rules of procedure do not deal with discipline of members of the body, and therefore I turn to Robert's Rules of Order, and there are provisions, in fact several chapters, about disciplining members of the body. And in section 61 it talks about the two types of offenses that can lead to discipline of members of the body. There is discipline that can result from something that occurs during the course of a public meeting, which, you know, obviously all the members would be witnesses to and could act promptly upon seeing any type of misconduct. Then it also talks about discipline of members for conduct that occurs elsewhere other than in the meeting. And what it provides there is, this is from section 61, if improper conduct by a member of a society occurs elsewhere than at a meeting, the members generally have no first-hand knowledge of the case. Therefore, if disciplinary action is to be taken, charges must be preferred and a formal trial held before the assembly of the society or before a committee, standing or special, which should be required to report its findings and recommendations to the assembly for the action. Then later in that chapter it provides that the procedures governing all such cases are described in detail in Chapter 63. If you turn to Chapter 63, it basically lays out an entire, in essence, kind of due process by which discipline for somebody, for a member of the body, can be effectuated. It talks about investigation and trial. It lays out basically 5 steps in a fair disciplinary process. That step 1 is confidential investigation by a committee. Number 2, report of the committee. Report of the committee and pre-referral of charges if warranted. Number 3, formal notification of the accused. Number 4, a trial. And number 5, the assembly's review of a trial committee's findings. So those are the processes that are laid out in Robert's Rules of Order. You know, it does note in Chapter 63, and this is probably a point that shouldn't be taken lightly, that these steps are required to ensure that a libel or a defamatory statement of fact is not achieved by the action of the body. So that's in essence what I've been able to discover from my review.
So my question is, the resolution is submitted. This doesn't meet any of the criteria spelled out in section 61 and 62 and 63 and 64.
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation of a censure, which is what this resolution provides, you know, attorneys are, can be censured by the state bar, that's discipline. Censure as defined by Black's Law Dictionary indicates it's an official reprimand or condemnation. Certainly, I know Mary could probably chime in on this. If we censured an employee, that would in essence be kind of a written warning, and I think that certainly constitutes discipline. So, I mean, my interpretation of it would be that a censure would be discipline, and therefore, under Robert's Rules of Order, we would be required to walk through those procedures before we took final action.
How detailed a procedure do you think this would be? How much time would have to be invested? I mean, if we're basically having sounds like a trial, I mean, is there going, as city attorney, I can't imagine that you would be representing anybody in
I mean, I would think I would have a conflict of interest. I mean, I represent the city, in the city's interests alone, and as, you know, I would have a conflict of interest. I couldn't preside over it. You know, procedurally, you know, the section 63, which goes through, I just gave you a quick Cliff's Notes version of it. Section 63, which lays out the procedure, is the procedure to be followed. See, it's about 16 pages long of procedure that's to be followed. And I gave you the 5 steps, but then it goes into detail as to what's required in each of those steps.
Other questions?
I'm curious if Councilmember Shute read these steps before you created this resolution.
Did I read all of chapter 61,
Did you read any of it?
63, and 64?
Did you read any of it?
I'm gonna have to take a look at my copy of Robert's Rules.
Is it different?
I don't know. I
Did you
don't
read
know what
it?
copy of Robert's Rules of Order.
Did you
the
actually,
attorney is stating.
did you create this document?
Yes, I did create this document, and I do understand the censure rules. And I also understand that, given the understanding we were not looking at a legal solution and rather moral ethical solution, that I did not believe that there was going to be a legal standard by which we would have to meet a reprimand here. Now, if that's what the city attorney determines, then we will have to re-examine this.
Mhm.
All right, Ryan, so a trial, does that sort of imply that there has to be something done illegally?
I'm sorry, Steve.
I said, does a trial sort of imply that there has to be some assertion that something is done illegally?
You mean as in against a criminal violation?
Well, or I mean, what is, you know, the findings that would have to come, you know, out of the trial? What would the accusation be? I mean, you mentioned two items: course of conduct in a public meeting, or conduct that occurs elsewhere. But I'm assuming that conduct would have to be, you know, some violation of the law. I would hope. I mean,
You know, this just deals with discipline for misconduct, and it doesn't really go into much more detail than that.
That would be
It
for
says,
a committee.
I'm
That
sorry.
would be for a committee to decide, right?
Right.
Whether the misconduct is valid or not.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna walk through these procedures, I said misconduct, I stand corrected, it says if improper conduct